You're all, I'm sure, aware of the Fermi paradox. In brief, where are they? Astrophysicists tell us that there are a vast number of planets similar enough to Earth so that we might have expected life to emerge, including what we call intelligent life. But with the most intense and sophisticated efforts, we can find no indication that intelligence exists anywhere but among us. There are scientific papers that provide possible explanations, but in the background, there's another thought that lingers. They are there. They're watching us, appalled, determined never to have anything to do with this insane and destructive species. That's regarded as a witticism, but if so, the joke's on us. There's more than ample reason for an intelligent creature to draw such conclusions, not just now, but throughout the history of human civilization. It's true that there have been glorious periods, perhaps none more so than the 17th century, the birth of the Enlightenment and the modern scientific revolution. Alfred North Whitehead hardly exaggerated when he wrote that ever since, quoting him, our intellectual life has been living upon the accumulated capital of ideas provided for them by the genius of the 17th century. Surely such moments should alleviate concerns about the angels of our nature. And so they do, if we do not lift the veil too far and see that in these same years, mutual slaughter in Europe reached peaks rarely attained, even in its extraordinarily savage history, with murderous wars over how to pray that wiped out much of the population, while European barbarians were perpetrating the worst genocide in human history in the Americas and initiating the most hideous slave regimes ever to exist. But nothing compares with today. It's a unique moment in human history. Humans are a very recent arrival on Earth, 200 to 300,000 years ago, the very last instant of the roughly 4 billion years of life. 200,000 years is about average survival time for species, and it will soon be learned whether humans decide to follow the normal course and bring human-sized society to an end. And by doing so, to end what has become a scourge to life on the planet, an anthropogenic global warming, habitat destruction, fouling the oceans, much else is bringing about the 6th extinction. It's comparable to the 5th extinction 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth, ending the age of the dinosaurs, opening a path for evolution of small mammals, ultimately us, the new asteroid. We are right now at a moment of confluence of challenges unique in human history: environmental catastrophe, nuclear war, new pandemics, all too many others. Crucially, for each imminent crisis, we know of feasible solutions which can lead to a better world. Nothing is more important than to keep that fact firmly in mind as an incentive to action. That much we know with fair confidence. What we do not know is whether humans, who have the fate of the world in their hands have the moral and intellectual capacity to rise to the challenge and do what must be done. And soon, there can be no delay. If they fail, the human experiment will be heading inexorably towards an inglorious end. The signs are mixed. To sample the dark side, 3 days ago, the Hawaiian Observatory that monitors CO2 in the atmosphere released its latest findings. Its major finding is that the standard measure, particles per million, continued its steady climb right through the pandemic, barely affected by the decline in economic activity. It's now approaching 420 particles per million. That's long regarded as a critical danger point. Yesterday, the ppm level reached 419.80 ppm. That's the highest June 9th in millions of years. In 1990, by comparison, it was 296. It's been climbing yearly. That's what we're doing to the atmosphere. And in the past half century, doing so in full awareness. A senior scientist at the observatory was quoted as saying that we're adding roughly 40 billion metric tons of CO2 pollution to the atmosphere per year. That's a mountain of carbon that we dig out of the earth, burn, and release into the atmosphere as CO2 year after year. If we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, the highest priority must be to reduce CO2 pollution to zero at the earliest possible date. Well, the earliest possible date is estimated by the major scientific monitors, the IPCC, to be mid-century, which means that fossil fuel use must be reduced right now, continuing every year. There have been significant steps forward in some places, but nowhere near adequate. On the positive side, the US has just emerged, temporarily at least, from a regime of unique malevolence, which was dedicated with fervor to the worst crime in human history, accelerating the race to the abyss by maximizing the use of fossil fuels and dismantling the regulatory apparatus that partially mitigated the disaster while also protecting the most vulnerable populations, mostly poor and minority, the prime victims of severe pollution. Of all the crimes of the Trump era, none comes anywhere near this one in severity, nor does any other crime. To repeat the charge, this is far and away the most grotesque crime in history when we consider the consequences for human life, for species generally. It's an outrageous charge, perhaps, just happens to be true. The malevolence does not end with the actions designed to terminate organized human life. Their impact reaches much farther as the doctrines are amplified through the Republican Party's echo chamber, Murdoch's Fox News, along with the talk radio network owned by far-right corporations, and the rest of the disinformation system that has exploded during recent years. Some of the effects can be found in the latest of the reports of the Yale University research group that carries out regular studies of popular opinion on global warming. It was released a few days ago. I'll quote it. Reports that over the past year, there has been a sharp decline in the percentages of both liberal moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans who think developing sources of clean energy should be a priority for the president and Congress. The current numbers are all-time lows since we first asked the question in 2010. For those concerned with the perpetuation of life on Earth, the figures are stunning. They should have received screaming headlines. These terrifying figures are the result of a disinformation campaign that has been carried out with particular fervor since 2010, when the question was first asked. Shortly before that, the Republican Party had begun to toy with mild measures on climate change. In his 2008 presidential campaign, Republican candidate John McCain had a limited climate change plank. Congressional Republicans were considering similar ideas. That set in motion a juggernaut launched by the huge Koch energy conglomerate to end any deviation from strict denialism. To spell it out more precisely, any deviation from the Koch conglomerate's commitment to end organized human life on Earth in the interests of short-term profit. It's a commitment shared more broadly among the masters of the economy, the actual masters of mankind, to borrow Adam Smith's characterization. The Republican Party capitulated totally, and since has been completely denialist. It's a crime of truly historical significance. Trump only carried the crime to caricature in his standard style. The enormity of this treachery can hardly be overstated. It's revealed in other studies as well. The Pew Research Center recently released a poll that presented 15 major issues and asked people to rank them in urgency. Respondents were divided into Republicans and Democrats. The responses of Democrats were not too encouraging, but those of Republicans are truly frightening. Of the 15 choices, the one ranked lowest in urgency was climate change. Climate change is the euphemism for heating the planet. It's only the most urgent issue in human history. It was ranked as urgent by 14% of respondents, along with sexism at the very bottom. Ranked highest were illegal immigration and the federal deficit. Illegal immigration is Trump's device for deflecting popular attention away from his fervent service to extreme wealth and corporate power, evident throughout his legislative programs. Like any skilled demagogue, Trump understood that his assault against his own voting base must be concealed by blaming scapegoats, the weak, the vulnerable, the usual targets. The fact that illegal immigration can be regarded as the most urgent problem we face is a testimonial to the talents of one of the most accomplished con men in modern history and to the immense propaganda apparatus that surrounds them. What about the deficit? That became an urgent problem on November 4th. As long as Trump was punching huge holes in the deficit with huge gifts to the super rich and the corporate sector, the deficit wasn't a problem. If, however, the deficit might be increased to help working people and the poor, it becomes a matter of cosmic significance. How can we impose this burden and on our children? All nonsense with interest rates hovering around zero. But what is most striking and disturbing is that while the cult of Trump worshippers favor the stimulus programs that benefit them, they nevertheless fervently support the political leadership that is devoted to banning them. Worship of the leader has become so extreme that even these elementary considerations are effaced. It's an ominous development. It awakens bitter memories. It's another very serious problem that we face. Again, we know how to confront it, but the task is not easy. The goal of ending fossil fuel use is typically framed as reaching net zero emissions. That makes sense, but there's a trap that's concealed. When ExxonMobil assures us that it's now committed to net zero emissions, it's important to look at the fine print. And what we find is a form of what's called greenwashing. Fossil fuel production will continue, even expand, but it will be offset by planting trees and by non-existent technologies to remove the poisons that we pour into the air. Biden's climate proposals incorporate a similar deep flaw. It does make good sense to try to develop technologies of carbon capture, but the bottom line is that poisoning the atmosphere must end. It's a feasible task, as is shown in many detailed studies, notably those of economists Robert Pullman, Jeffrey Sachs, backed by the International Energy Agency. Again, the importance of these studies cannot be overstressed. The challenge can be met, not only containing the crisis, but leading to a better world with better conditions of life and work. So where do we stand in meeting these goals? A few weeks ago, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Ed Markey, introduced a resolution calling for a Green New Deal, spelling out the measures that should be taken in considerable detail, much along the lines of the careful studies of the matter. It's a resolution that's a stepping stone to legislation, but it's not quite there. Predictably, Republicans were furiously opposed. Biden himself vacillated, not rejecting it, refusing to endorse it. Activist pressures can tip the balance, just as they already have in pressuring Biden to adopt a climate program that's far superior to any predecessor, though still well short of what has to be done. There's also encouraging news on the critically important labor front. Cecil Roberts is the president of the United Mine Workers of America, presented a plan that, quoting him, calls for creation of new jobs in Appalachia through tax credits that would subsidize the making of solar panel and wind turbine components and by funding the reclamation of abandoned mines that pose a risk to public health. In California, 19 unions have just endorsed a very detailed program for economic recovery, clean energy transition, developed by Robert Pollin and his colleagues, program that offers quite realistic prospects for meeting the state's environmental goals while also creating hundreds of thousands of new and better jobs and providing for workers who are caught in the transition. These are highly significant breakthroughs. A central element of a Green New Deal must be providing for workers displaced by shutting down the fossil fuel industry. And more generally, a revitalized labor movement can resume its historical role as leading the way to constructive social change on the environment as well. In the early 1970s, there was a significant rise in labor militancy, mostly repressed, but not entirely. That included the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International. The leading figure in the union, Tony Mazzocchi, was one of the earliest outspoken environmentalists who was speaking for workers who are right on the front line, facing destruction of the environment every day at work. They were also the driving force behind the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, protecting workers on the job. And they went on from there. Mazzocchi was a harsh critic of capitalism as well as a committed environmentalist. He held that workers should control the plant environment. They should also take the lead in combating industrial pollution. As the Democrats abandoned working people in the 1970s, becoming a party of Wall Street and affluent professionals, Mazzocchi began to advocate for a union-based labor party. It's an initiative that made considerable progress in the 1990s, but it couldn't survive the decline of the labor movement under severe business government attack. That's nothing new in America's unusually violent labor history. Labor has revived before, dramatically in the 1930s, can do so again. On the environmental crisis, we should regularly repeat to ourselves the words of Oxford physicist Raymond Pierre Humbert, one of the lead contributors to the IPCC reports. His words are very simple. Panic now. Panic, but don't despair. There's too much work to be done. We have to recognize that the threat is dire, but that there are ways to overcome it. The same is true of the second of the major threats to survival, nuclear weapons. We've been living under that shadow for 75 years, since August 6th, 1945, a day indelibly etched in memory, at least in mine. On that grim day, human intelligence revealed that it had risen to the level, perhaps sunk to the level, to have devised the means for species suicide. Not quite yet. It would take further progress to achieve that goal. And it was reached shortly after, when the US and then the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons. In that day, 1953, the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was set to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest it reached to terminal disaster until the Trump years, when the analysts gave up on minutes and shifted to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight, the setting right now. Well, here too, there's bad news and good news. The bad news reached its heights during the Trump years, the reason for that setting. Trump's guiding principle, apart from service to great wealth and corporate power, was very simple: wreck. Anything not constructed by the sociopathic megalomaniac in the White House had to be wrecked. I won't run through the list, which is impressive, but we'll keep to the one that matches his dedication to destroy the environment that sustains life. The one competitor to this awesome crime is smashing to bits the arms control regime that had been laboriously constructed over many years, which at least mitigated the threat. Trump didn't quite complete the task. The New START treaty was saved from the wrecking ball literally by hours. Biden was able to respond to Russian requests to extend the treaty just hours before its expiration on February 5th. But the wreckage remains. Regrettably, the Biden administration so far seems committed to perpetuate the Trump destruction, not only by developing new and highly threatening weapons, but also by rejecting Russian offers to reestablish treaties that Trump had dismantled. Most recently, the Open Skies Treaty, which dates back to Eisenhower. That's some of the bad news. There's also good news. There are feasible solutions to the threat of nuclear weapons. Solutions are straightforward: rid the earth of these monstrous creations. A few months ago, a momentous step was taken in the path toward sanity: the entry into force of the United Nations Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, signed by 122 nations. It could herald a new dawn. It could, if it were not for the bad news. The bad news is that the signers do not yet include the nuclear powers themselves, and that little word "yet" signifies the momentous task that lies before those of us who hope for a better future. In fact, for a future at all. Those who've reviewed the record know that it's a near miracle that we have survived the nuclear age thus far, whether because of numerous accidents or in some cases, the reckless acts of political leaders. Miracles are not likely to continue forever. Even short of abolition, important steps can be taken. One is the establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. This approach has had some success. Much of the world has indicated its abhorrence of these hideous inventions by establishing such zones. Latin America, the Pacific, Africa. There are flaws. The Pacific zone could not go into effect for some years because France insisted on testing nuclear weapons in its dependencies. And since it finally stopped, can't go into effect because the United States maintains nuclear weapons facilities on the islands it controls, the Pacific Islands. The African zone faces a similar barrier. Britain insists on maintaining its former colonial possession, Diego Garcia, rejecting the judgment of the World Court and the United Nations General Assembly that the true sovereign is African Mauritius. Britain expelled much of the population in order to provide the United States with a military base, which was upgraded to accommodate nuclear weapons under Obama. It's not mere symbolism. Diego Garcia has been a major base for bombing in Central and West Asia, and it also blocks full implementation of the African nuclear weapons-free zone. By far, the most important such zone would be in the Middle East. If it were established, it would eliminate what US leaders have claimed for many years to be one of the greatest threats to world peace, Iranian nuclear programs. Recognition of the threat is not unanimous. US intelligence informed Congress that if Iran has plans to develop nuclear weapons, which they don't know, it would be part of Iran's general strategy to deter aggression from its hostile neighbors, Israel and the Gulf states, which have far more advanced military systems than Iran. But let's put disbelief aside and accept the claim that Iran's nuclear programs exist and are a leading threat to world peace. Every sane person should therefore welcome the possibility of ending the threat peacefully, without criminal assassinations, without sabotage, large-scale cyber war, murderous sanctions to which the world is forced to conform under US threat, and serious tensions and provocations that might lead to devastating war. Actually, war is not a remote possibility. Iran is openly under threat of attack by the United States and Israel, already being attacked. And if it's attacked further, it might well retaliate with missile attacks on the world's major petroleum facilities, which happen to be in northeast Saudi Arabia, well within Iran's range. And after that, one hesitates to imagine. Well, surely putting an end to these ongoing crimes and horrifying possibilities would be a most welcome development if it were possible. It is possible. In fact, it's simplicity itself, and everyone knows how. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with intensive inspections. And these can be quite reliable. Even US intelligence agrees that they were highly reliable before Trump withdrew from the joint agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons. So are there obstacles to establishing the zone? Not from the Arab states. They initiated the proposal decades ago. They've been strenuously advocating it ever since. Not from Iran, which for years has strongly called for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone. Not from the global south, the former non-aligned countries called G77 now, over 130 countries. They too have vigorously endorsed the proposal. There are no objections from Europe nor from Asia. One country stands in the way, the United States. Whenever the opportunity arises In an international forum, it is vetoed by Washington, most recently by President Obama in 2015. Various pretexts are offered, but the real reasons are not obscure. The United States wants to protect Israel's nuclear weapon systems from inspection. In fact, the United States does not even officially recognize their existence, though it's not in doubt. And there are good reasons for that stance. If Washington were to officially recognize that Israel has developed nuclear weapons, US law would come into play. It bans US military and economic aid to countries that develop nuclear weapons outside the framework of the international nuclear weapons regime. Arguably, then, the vast flow of US aid to Israel, which is beyond any parallel, would be illegal. Neither political party in the United States wants to open that door, and no organized force presses the matter, which is, in fact, almost undiscussable in the United States, outside of narrow arms control circles and in critical literature. These are no minor facts. Tensions in the Middle East are very real and ominous for the region and the world. Many of the tensions arise from Iran's nuclear programs and the alleged threat that they pose, an existential threat that calls for a violent reaction in the official Israeli version, often echoed in the United States. It's then of considerable import that there's a straightforward way to resolve the matter peaceably. That's not beyond what popular activism can achieve. 40 years ago, some of the largest demonstrations in history took place in the United States, Canada, Europe, protesting plans to install highly destabilizing weapons in Europe. That was a large part of the background for the Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty in 1987, banning these weapons, significantly lowering the threat of war. The treaty was demolished by Trump's wrecking ball on the eve of Hiroshima Day in 2019, followed at once by deployment of weapons violating the treaty to show that Trump meant business in marching to disaster. We should remember the events of 40 years ago and the many other occasions when popular mobilization made a difference. The tasks are clear. Well, I've briefly discussed the two most severe elements of the confluence of challenges. There are others. One, which is quite naturally the focus of attention right now, is the pandemic. It will be overcome at terrible cost and needless cost, as we can see from the countries where it was contained. More pandemics will come. Steps can be taken to reduce the threat and to deal with it expeditiously if it arrives. It's known how, but knowledge is not enough. Action must follow. That's not all. The democratic political system is under severe threat, and along with it, the very possibility of rational discourse, the only hope for confronting the confluence of challenges. It's quite frightening to see how effectively Trump has demolished the sphere of rational interchange, fragile as it was. The firm and unshakable convictions of his worshippers are almost too astonishing to recount. The fervor of the stolen election beliefs are hard enough to credit, but it gets much worse. A quarter of Republicans are reported to believe, and quoting the polls, that the government, media, and financial worlds in the United States are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. It's a quarter of Republicans. Far more consequential, if less exotic, is the dismissal of the heating of the planet at a moment when we must panic now or pay a bitter price. To be sure, Trump was hardly alone in driving fact and reason off the map. His favorite commentator, the late Rush Limbaugh, was telling his audience of tens of millions that the four corners of deceit are government, media, academia, and science. So anything goes, what some have called epistemicide, the end of knowledge and understanding, the doctrine that my ignorance is as good as your knowledge, Isaac Asimov's rendition of the threat. Well, without continuing, I'll just repeat the essential words. Panic now, but don't despair. Far too much is at stake.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. So many questions coming in just voraciously, but I'm going to let Nancy Fraser first respond, and then we're going to go through some of the questions that have been most popular among the rather large audience, if that's all right with you. If you, in the meantime, when you respond, could turn up your speaker just a little bit, that would be helpful for people to be able to hear you better. Thank you. Nancy Fraser, please.
Thank you, Annie. It's a real pleasure and an honor to participate in this session and to respond to Noam Chomsky. I am not a person normally given to hero worship or hero praise, but if I do have any heroes, Noam Chomsky, you're at the very top of the list. And that goes back many, many decades to my days in Philadelphia draft resistance with your sister-in-law, Judy. Anyway, you have here given us a masterful presentation, a sort of diagnosis of the moment in which we are situated, the very severe and acute, dire character of this situation, the necessity of acting, of rising to the challenge. And you've, I think, beautifully sort of squared the circle of not mincing words with how bad things are, but also giving us the kind of encouragement we need to respond, to try to rise to the challenge by showing us that there are solutions and that there are even hopeful signs here and there mixed in with all the bad ones. I just want to say how much I appreciate this phrase in your title, The Confluence of Challenges. I think it's a great phrase. Confluence suggests a very special situation in which any one of the four challenges you identified, and we could add more to that list, any one of them would be potentially catastrophic in itself. But when we have their confluence, their convergence, we're in a truly unique and special historical moment. It's a kind of hinge point in our history as a species and in the history of the planet. To call the items that are confluencing challenges is also great, because that word speaks to us. To speak of challenges is to say that there is an addressee. A challenge is addressed to someone. We are called upon to respond. Now, you identified, as I said, 4 of these: the heating of the planet, nuclear war, the pandemic, and then this last point about democracy, and I like this word, which I hadn't heard before, epistemicide, this idea that the very public sphere and the discursive resources and capacities that we need to process what's going on, to chart a way forward, are themselves imperiled, which in effect is to say that it becomes all that more difficult to chart a path forward on any of the other challenges because of the destruction and deformation of public discourse. So I want to essentially raise 2 questions, and both of which I think have to do with sort of how exactly we might rise to the challenges, to the confluence. And these are questions then that bear on the politics of the conjuncture, which have to do with where there are openings, where there are prospects for intervention, where there are strategies, and where there might be social forces, constituencies, who could be brought on board in this case. So you spoke quite a bit about the Republican Party and about Trump, and I was happy to see that you also spoke a bit about the Democratic Party, because they are hardly blameless in this situation. A lot of what you said, quite correctly, looks at the 4 years of Trumpism and the very severe damage that was done on each front, on climate, on nuclear weapons, well, you didn't say too much about it, but we could tell a story about the pandemic and about the destruction of public discourse. But we know, and I think that you also gave us some signposts for understanding that 40 years of bipartisan neoliberalization and the failure to achieve a true post-Cold War, a true new world order that would have overcome the Russophobia and so on and so forth. That's a bipartisan background here, against which all of these, against which the carbon emissions shot up through the roof, and so on and so forth. So I'm just curious. I was interested that you referred to, I saw 2 different impulses in your talk. One is the Green New Deal, the let's say the Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party might be a vehicle for change that one could get behind and even push further in these directions. I'm curious as to how you see Biden himself and the Biden administration, whether that's some sort of fragile, uneasy compromise between the 2 wings of the Democratic Party, whether there's any opening there at all. And the other thing that you mentioned was the revival of the labor movement. And going back to the idea of a third party, a labor party, we know that for our constitutional system, our electoral system, makes that extremely difficult. Anyway, just at the political level, I'd love to hear a little bit more about where you see the party side of it. I understand the social movement, the activist side of it. So that's my first question. And
Nancy?
yeah, you want me to?
We don't,
stop
yeah,
already?
yes,
Okay.
please, because we've
Fine.
run short a bit, and there are so
Fair
many
enough.
questions that dovetail
Fair
with precisely your, no, these are excellent, excellent issues, and they dovetail so much with what the questions coming in from the audience look like, such as one asking, how do we realign the identitarian left with broad-based movements sympathetic to the working class? What do you recommend as a path forward, Professor Chomsky? How do we improve our societal ability to collaborate? And I think those two really address some of what Nancy was getting at as well. So I will just stop with those two, but there are several more I hope we have time to get to. Thank you.
Well, with regard to the political system, which is collapsing, the United States basically is a one-party state. I think it was maybe C. Wright Mills who pointed out 60 years ago that the United States has one political party, the business party, has two factions called Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans for a long time, all my lifetime, have been essentially a rich man's club. Of the two business parties, they're the ones who've been more committed to service to super rich business world generally. There were exceptions. There have been times when I voted for Republicans, when they used to be a political party many years ago. The Democrats had, during the New Deal period, were a party committed to the needs of working people, poor, minorities, and others. Many flaws, but generally that was true. That lasted through the period of what is sometimes called regimented capitalism, the great growth period, egalitarian growth through the 1960s. By the early 70s, it was beginning to erode. There was a business counteroffensive, started strongly in the 70s, took off under Reagan, Thatcher in England, turned into the neoliberal regime of the last 40 years. By that time, as I think I mentioned, the Democrats had essentially abandoned the working class. Maybe the last gasp was the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill in 1968, 1978. Carter, president at the time, didn't veto it, but he watered it down so that it had no teeth. That was understood by working people at the time, too late. Some of you may remember a statement by Doug Fraser, the head of the United Auto Workers, who pulled out of a joint labor management committee organized by Carter, pulled out because he said that business, and by implication the Democrats, had abandoned the tacit contract of the last 20 years in which there would be some concern on the part of business, some willingness to compromise on rights of working people. It was kind of a belated discovery, but it was a discovery. By that time, the Democrats were on their way to becoming what the mainstream political party is now, Clintonite party, Clinton-Obama party, party of Wall Street donors and affluent professionals, very cool and so on, but has nothing to say to working people. Obama made that explicit in his first 2 years in office when he had Congress in his hands and completely gave it away. The most striking example was the TARP legislation. There was a financial crisis, major crisis. There was a bailout. Congress passed legislation which had two prongs: bail out the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks, the insurance companies, the fraudulent lenders who had essentially created the crisis, so bail them out, and also give some aid and sustenance to the victims, the people who had lost their homes under foreclosure and lost their jobs and so on. Well, only one half of that was enacted. The other half was totally forgotten. You didn't have to be a genius to see what was happening. One of many other examples. Clinton already had moved very far towards accepting the full neoliberal programs. And on the second question that was raised about the end of the Cold War, it was Clinton who made the decisions to move NATO to the east. The Bush administration, the first Bush administration, had promised Gorbachev that if he agreed to unification of Germany, that NATO would not move to the east. At the time, what was meant by the east was East Germany. Nobody was even talking about anything else. Well, of course, they broke the promise, but Clinton went further and moved NATO all the way to the Russian border. Obama intensified it by putting ABM stations on the Russian border, which are basically dual purpose. They could be used defensively, and the Russians know it, and other strategic analysts know it. You can read about it in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So yes, there's a lot of shared responsibility. And what's happened, Reagan understood very well, just as Thatcher did, or whoever was thinking for him, that when you're going to carry out a major attack against working people and the poor, which is what the neoliberal programs are, you better destroy the defense that working people have. And the defense is unions. So the first steps of the Reagan-Thatcher administration were a sharp attack against unions, opening the door to practices considered illegal before that on the part of employers, which were then picked up by the corporate sector. And so it goes on to a devastating assault on labor, not for the first time in American history. Well, what was the nature of this assault for 40 years? There are some measures of it. It's worth keeping in mind. So the Rand Corporation, a couple of months ago, did a study of what they call the transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class. That's the lower 90% of income. The transfer of wealth from them to the very top of the income level means mainly the top 0.1%. Their estimate was $47 trillion. It's not small change, vast underestimate. It doesn't take into account the other measures that were opened up for robbery of the public under the Reagan administration with Democratic support, like opening tax havens, previously illegal, and cutting back on the IRS so that it can't enforce robbery. Many other measures. I don't have time to go through them, but if you think them through, they approximately double the level of robbery. We're talking about a major attack on the population in which the Democrats participated. Well, coming up to today, this happened in Europe as well. It's called austerity, same principles. What this has left is a lot of anger, rage, a lot of resentment, contempt for political institutions, fertile terrain for demagogues who can come along and say, I'm your savior, follow me, and blame somebody else. Meanwhile, continue the service to the same neoliberal programs. That's what we're seeing. Now, what about the Democrats? Well, they're split. there's a big, the Republicans are split as well, but the Democrats are split between a Clintonite party management, which is basically Wall Street oriented, affluent, professional oriented, and a base which is different. It was energized by the Sanders movement, but there's a lot going on, very activist base. Ocasio-Cortez is a symbol of it. Getting to the Green New Deal, how did the Green, first of all, we should recognize that a Green New Deal is not just an option, it's a necessity for survival. You can discuss details, but the basic principles, which are shared by the economists I mentioned, the International Energy Agency, the resolution that was just introduced, it's all roughly the same. Something like that has to happen, including the closing down of fossil fuel use within a couple of decades. It's possible, but not easy. So it's not an option. A couple of years ago, that was completely off the agenda. It was an object of ridicule. It was even mentioned. It was moved towards the center of attention by activists, almost all young. Things like Climate Strike, Extinction Rebellion, and the Sunrise Movement in the United States, which got to the point of occupying congressional offices, including Nancy Pelosi's. Well, you do that, you're usually thrown out by the Capitol Police. This time, not. They got support from some of the young representatives who came in on the Sanders wave. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez particularly got some support in the Senate from Ed Markey, Democratic senator, long involved in environmental issues. And that moved the Democratic Party program. If you watch it closely, right through 2020, if you were observing as I was doing, the Democratic Party webpage, you could see the conflict going on between the Clintonite management, which wanted to kill it, and the popular forces, which were pressing Biden to move towards accepting something. And in fact, the program he finally came out with is way beyond anything that preceded it, though with plenty of flaws. So it can work, and it can continue. Where we stand now is very clear. The Republicans have made it perfectly honest, or perfectly open, no secret. They have one goal: make the country ungovernable. Make sure that Biden can achieve nothing so that the wreckage can be blamed on the Democrats and they can come back to power in 2 years and 4 years. It's a strategy that could work. The other part of it is the radical efforts to institute essentially Jim Crow laws with the help of the reactionary Supreme Court to reinstitute them so that they can cut down sharply the voting of the wrong people, Afro-Americans, minorities, poor people who tend to vote Democrat. So these two strategies, cut back the vote, make the country ungovernable, they could work. It's possible.
Professor Chomsky, I am loath to interrupt in any way, just because I think you're already answering some of the questions coming from the thousands of people who are out there, but I still would like to at least offer them, even if you have in a way answered some. One of the questions that's been very popular is, what advice would you give young people? And I think you have been doing it all along, who have find themselves hopeless in the face of this confluence of challenges. And the other one is, can you clarify your position on the value of the degrowth and socialist perspectives in approaching climate action? The first one on what is to be done, right? You have answered that in many ways, but they're asking again, what should they be doing?
What should they be doing is exactly what young people are doing. The young people who have made the differences that we're seeing. I mean, some was mentioned, draft resistance was mentioned before from the 60s. Very important movement. Nancy mentioned it, I was closely involved in it myself. It was a major movement. But if you look at the level of activism in the late 60s, it's less than it is today. There, you look around today, maybe not as dramatic, but the actual participation of young people in one or another form of constructive activism is, I think, well beyond what it was in the 60s, except very few brief moments. And so what's to be done? Join it. It's had big impacts on the past. It's worth thinking about just how much of an impact activism has had. I mentioned the enormous protests in the early 80s that led to the INF Treaty, which was no small step, an important step, reduced the danger of war very significantly up until Trump dismantled it. But there's a lot more. Just think what the country was like in the early 60s before the activism took off. Remember what the country was like. The country had anti-miscegenation laws that were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. Federal housing by law was segregated. One of the major legacies of racism, huge legacies, but one of them is that during the 50s and the 60s, when there was a growth period and there was federally funded housing, Afro-Americans were excluded because by law, federal funding had to be segregated. So they were cut out of the opportunity to buy a small house somewhere. And in the United States, wealth is mostly housing, which has a major impact. It wasn't until the late 60s that these racist laws were stopped. There was no feminism. Women literally were regarded as property under the law. That's laws that go back to the founding of the Constitution, took over British common law. Women are property, not peers. That wasn't changed legally until 1975. I mean, it's been cut away at, but it wasn't until 1975 that women had the legally guaranteed right by the courts to be jurors in federal trials, that is, to be recognized as peers. There were anti-sodomy laws into this century. I mean, the country was radically different from what it is now. And it didn't change by magic. It changed by committed, dedicated activism, very hard. And the current years, it's been happening right in front of our eyes, like putting the Green New Deal to the point where it's at least a resolution and can be moved to legislation. That's a major achievement of young activists and one that's absolutely essential for survival. And the same can be true on the other issues I mentioned. So for example, moving towards a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is not an impossibility. There'd be a lot of support for that among the general population if it wasn't a victim of epidemicide. Good word to use. For those of you who are interested, I might tell you where the word comes from. It's interesting, it tells you something. It comes from an article, a letter that appeared in the main British medical journal a week ago, British Medical Journal. There's an article, there's a letter, strong letter, denouncing what they call political censorship in medical academic journals. And what they're referring to is the decision of the world's leading medical journal, The Lancet, to withdraw from a website, still quoting the letter, to withdraw from their website a report they had already published on the potential of the pandemic to devastate one of the world's most vulnerable populations. It was a letter which described in great detail, a report which described in great detail the shocking health conditions in the Gaza prison before the latest Israeli attack, which had a devastating effect. The Lancet was under tremendous pressure, a threat of boycott by mostly US doctors to withdraw the report, and they succumbed to it. That's what the writers of this article called epistemic, cutting out knowledge. You're not allowed to report certain kinds of information, just as you're not. There's very clear examples right here. As you know, the Republican-run states now are passing legislation to ban instruction in what's called critical race theory. That's the new demon, replacing communism, Islamic terror as the plague of the age. What's critical race theory? It's the scare phrase used for the study of the systematic, structural, cultural factors in the hideous 400 years of slavery and enduring racism and white supremacy. So you're not allowed to teach it in the schools. You have to bar that more of that epistemicide. It's a good word to be used, a lot of application. And some of it are these things, but it doesn't have to be the case. It can be overcome. Going back to what young people ought to do, overcome it, just the way lots of other things have been overcome with hard struggles. I mean, you have a choice. You can decide to be hopeless, say, I give up, help ensure that the worst will happen, or you can recognize that there are opportunities, there are possibilities, they're right in front of us, just as there have been in the past. You can grasp them. It's a hard struggle, but maybe you'll make it a better world, as has happened in the past. That's not much of a choice.
Somewhat grim note, a question that's come up. How can we advocate for truth in a climate where people don't trust the word of scientific and academic institutions?
We should work hard to overcome it. So where there is epistemicide, as in the cases I mentioned, work to overcome it. There's plenty of support to do so. It's not an irremediable disease. In fact, if you want to look at some more good news, take the Republican poll results that I mentioned. They're divided in various ways among younger Republicans, younger ones, millennials. There's much more of an openness towards recognizing reality, such as the reality of the climate disaster. It's the older ones who are much more refusing, who are who are wedded to this idea that there's a great replacement taking place. It's part of the reason for the fear of immigrants, in which traditional Christian, white supremacist America is disappearing. Well, it is, fortunately, but all of that can be pressed forward. Plenty of possibilities. The idea, the limbo insanity, maybe many people believe it, but they can be talked out of it, and others certainly can. It's by no means an impossible task. In fact, just think of the people you know. The people in your surroundings don't believe this, and that can be expanded. But we didn't get to Nancy's second question. What was that?
Yeah, it was really about exactly what you're talking about. I'm just wondering how you see the relationship between this sort of Trumpian epistemicide, if I can say the word, and the other problem that you've talked about, which I would call ordinary garden variety of bourgeois hegemony, where you can't question support for Israel. You have to say you can't, acknowledge nuclear weapons. All of these blinders that even under non-Trumpian times, right, severely limit what can be said. I mean, one idea is that there's been a crack up of the bourgeois hegemony in response to all of those attacks on working classes and on the standard of living, so that people have gotten angry. I'm trying to understand what the relation between these two things is, because if we got over the epistemicide and went back to the limiting blinders of the bourgeois hegemony, we would still have a major problem on our hands.
Well, there are many aspects to this. Take the example of epistemicide. I have the same problem saying the word that you do. The epistemicide that was brought up in the British Medical Journal. That's changing too, substantially, even among evangelicals. Evangelicals are the hardest nut to crack. In the case of support for Israeli crimes, they're the basic center of support. But among younger evangelicals, that's declining. Many are refusing to accept it, just as among millennial Republicans, many are refusing to accept the highly destructive, devastating ideas that are dominating the voting base now. And the very fact that evangelicals are the major base for support for Israeli crimes, that tells us a lot. You look back a couple of decades, support for Israeli crimes and atrocities was uniform among liberal Americans. I mean, I can tell you my own experience. I couldn't give talks on it at universities without police protection. That's all changed. By now, among people who identify themselves as liberal Democrats, there's probably more support for Palestinian rights than for what Israel's doing. Support for the Israeli crimes has shifted to the far right, the evangelicals, ultranationalists, the military industry, and so on. That's a major change. And it's a way of cutting back on the epistemicide, and we've seen it. So for example, after the latest assault on Gaza, just the last couple of weeks, was a huge change in mainstream coverage. For the first time ever, something almost unimaginable happened. You had mainstream columnists saying it's time to reconsider whether we should even give aid to Israel, if this is what they're going to do with it, aid which is arguably illegal in the first place. Okay, that's a change. That's the way you change things. It's the way, going back to the way I described the 60s, everything I described there has, and much more, has been changed by intense educational, organizational, activist work. You have to cut away at it. It's also true of the fundamental structure of the society. It's very interesting now. There are challenges. I mean, for the first time in quite a long time, to the very idea of, at the core of the basic structure of what you call bourgeois hegemony. The idea that people should be happy to be able to work for a master, to subordinate themselves to somebody else's control. You look through history for millennia, since classical times, right through the 19th century, this was considered the utter abomination. The idea that you should be subordinated to the rule of a master was considered utterly intolerable. That went right through the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Working people in the 19th century, and they had a very active, very lively, vibrant free press, were writing very eloquently about the attack on their fundamental dignity and rights by being forced to accept subordination to a master in the industrial system. That's an attack on their rights as free Americans. This was such a popular idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln, but more dramatically through the working class movement, which held that those who work in the mills should own them and run them, as they said. Well, that was true of the farmers' movement too. Remember, there was a real populist movement then, not what's called populism now, movement of radical farmers. That's most of the population in the late 19th century. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, opposing the domination of Northeastern bankers and who controlled the markets and the prices. They wanted to take it over themselves, have what they called a cooperative commonwealth in which farmers would run their own affairs, the marketing, their own banks, planting, working together. They began to unify with the Knights of Labor, the main labor organization, coming very close to a major radical democratic movement in the United States. Could have changed the country dramatically. Well, it was beaten down by violence. We have a very violent labor history, but the seeds are still there and they're coming back. There's a lot of, so far pretty small, but significant moves towards worker self-managed enterprises, cooperatives, localism, lots of moves which challenge the basic idea that you should subordinate yourself to a master. That's very significant. I think that can move forward.
I want to thank you, Professor Chomsky, for reminding us to panic, to continue to panic, but not to despair, and to assume the agency that we all have and that we need to animate evermore. So we are there following you as always, with you guiding our way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.